Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Anyway, so without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit about Byron. He's been on the show before, and he's an author of the Urantia. I guess experience for me is a good way of saying it. I believe that our spirituality is very much a personal experience, and Byron is a multiple award-winning author. He's an editor and a book publisher. Most recently, he's released Your Evolving Soul, The Cosmic Spirituality of the Urantia Revelation on Origin Press. Other books he's written is Healing a Broken World, The Adventure of Being Human, which I believe I have a copy of, and I loved it, and One World Democracy. He's a leading expert on the Urantia Book. He has also trained extensively in the Christian and Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and his graduate studies have embraced history, literature, religious studies, and theology. So without further ado, let me welcome Byron to the show today. Hello, Byron. How are you? Welcome.
Hello, Bernard. It's a great honor to be back on your show, and I just love Revolution Radio, so let's create a revolution today.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for reaching out to me and letting me know that you had a new book. I appreciate getting the heads up, and I'm very grateful that you were able to come and join us today. So, Byron, let's kind of remind everybody, for those of our listeners that may not remember our last time together. I think it was about 2 years ago you were here last.
Yeah, it was 2 or 3 years ago, a little while back.
Yeah, so we have to refresh everybody's memory. So why don't we start off a little bit? Tell us what got you involved with the Urantia experience, and or what was it that drew you into this work in spirituality, spiritual philosophy, and now focusing on the human soul?
Well, thank you. First of all, for the introduction, and for this big question, which is very personal to me because I was pretty much a regular guy living in Ohio, Cincinnati, and but we were going through revolutionary times. It was the late '60s, early '70s, and like everybody else, I was looking for some radical solutions, and began to open up to metaphysical realities. But primarily, I was into politics and left-wing politics in those days. So it was not likely that I would open up to something revelatory, but thanks to psychedelics, I had an opening for a spirit that came into me, and soon thereafter, in reading metaphysical texts, I heard just in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. on a radio show, a campus radio show, somebody talking about the Urantia Book, and they said that the book had been handed out to people from a flying saucer, which isn't the case, but anyway, it sounded pretty amazing, so I immediately picked this book up, and it was 1974. And I don't know, for whatever reason, it was a soul affinity for me, and I immediately recognized this as a core text for my life. And yes, you're right, it's an experience. The Urantia experience is an experience of certain truths about our lives and about our world, and also about the soul, the human soul. So many years later, 40 years later, I've put out a book about the soul according to the Urantia Book, and eager to talk to you about that.
Oh, great. And, I can't help but love the fact of the myth behind your answer coming out of a flying saucer. If only for the reason that my book was a revelation for myself. And my book was channeled through me during a shamanic vision quest, of course, a psychedelic experience. And I've just seen so many other authors and other spiritual revelations come through in that manner. What are the parallels of that and how the Urantia book came about, and I guess the mythology of it being handed out of a UFO? What is the myth, and the parallels of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, really. That was just one guy in Cincinnati who somehow came up with that. But the myth had been, in that period, people said that it had been discovered in a locker in the Greyhound bus station in Chicago and things, really odd things like that, because they kind of suppressed the story of how it came through, because purportedly the celestial authors said, don't focus people on that. Focus people on the content.
Uh-huh.
Because if you focus on the way it came through, the people it came through, then people will be diverted from the
Yes.
from the key point, which is true, because that happened in Christianity, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to get sort of hung up on the medium, and instead let's look at the content. But it's definitely worth knowing that the Urantia book comes to us not through channeling, but through something beyond that we haven't seen before. There was no channel, and if there had been a channel, then they would have been able to copyright the book, because it turns out that courts will give you the copyright if you channeled it. If you are the channeler, that's like being an author. But when the Urantia Foundation was sued by this wealthy guy who said, prove that you own the rights, right? So they couldn't prove it because there is no author, there was no channel.
Nice.
Yeah, so this is all in these court documents that came out recently, that they said, well, it basically just appeared. And so the inquiry shows that that they believe it materialized.
Oh, wonderful. Ooh.
Yeah, so there's new research on that coming out, and people done archival research, and all the people that were around it at the time. And I heard this story, and kind of thought it was a myth actually in the beginning, that the chapters appeared one at a time, materializing but not exactly like typed up. They showed up in handwriting. So a whole chapter.
Nice.
Come through like overnight. So they would find it the next day in a particular location, and it would be handwritten in perfect English, no need for editing, no need even for proofreading. And that's how these chapters came through. It's 196 chapters. So it's
my goodness. Wow.
big text. And that went on for 20 years. So the chapter would come through. They call them papers, by the way, so I'll call them papers instead of chapters. These papers would appear on the desk of the contact person, and they checked his handwriting, and it wasn't the handwriting on these papers. And they checked everybody's handwriting. It was nobody's handwriting, but it was handwritten, and it's believed that these angelic beings wrote it in the room and left it there for this guy. But then they started, these papers started appearing in a safe.
Oh.
And they would read it. These people, there was a small group. They would read it, and the celestial beings would say, "Do you have any questions about it?" And so, yes, they would have questions. And so they had these channeling sessions that were real, true channeling sessions, where they said, "Well, what does this mean? And can you amplify this? And can you define that?" So the celestials would put out a new edition of the paper, which would appear like the next day, corrected. And after a short time, they said, "Well, bring in other people, not just the half dozen of you." And so they brought in 200 readers, and they would read this, feed questions, and then the celestial beings would do new editions of the papers. So this went on from 1924 to 1942.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's never been anything quite like it that I've ever heard of. And so it's interactive. It's not just like dropping this text on your head.
Yeah, yeah.
It
It's
was
it's almost like a trans-dimensional communication. It's beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, it's definitely from that other dimension, and the beings who are the sort of the public, you might say, the sponsors of it, are very high level celestial beings, but there are beings at a more our vibrational level that were the ones that materialized it and that interacted all the time with them. And I want to get to this later if you like, because those beings are related to the 1111 phenomenon.
Oh, cool. Very interesting. Wonderful.
Whole other topic, but that's
Yeah,
an
yeah.
important topic because they purport to be the ones that began the 1111 phenomenon, this type of being,
Oh, okay.
many years ago in the 60s. And but anyway, this being, they're known as midwayers. They're angels that are between the human level and the seraphim level, and they're the ones that contact humans most intimately, according to the Urantia text. And they are a very important story about who they are. But anyway, that's how the thing came through, and they kind of did the final proofing by 1945, just at the end of the war, World War II. And then but it took the Celestial said wait a little bit and print it a little bit later. So they printed it in 1955. That's when it came out.
Oh, wow. And I've seen copies, and I believe I had a copy in my early 20s, but at that point I wasn't ready to receive that information. I don't think I had my experience until I was about 25 or 26, but I've always been drawn to the information, for lack of a better term. Now, moving on a little bit, I can't believe we've already gone through 20 minutes. This is fantastic information. Thank you. What do you mean when, or actually anybody that talks about your answer, what is meant by the term, the revelation, a revelation, that the book is a revelation?
Yeah, I mean, we think that it's revelatory in the same way that Christians think the Bible is revelatory and Muslims think the Quran is a revelation, a textual revelation. And, especially Muslims think that the Quran is word for word, written by the angel that's Gabriel, right? So the Urantia book is revelatory in the sense that there are 21 angelic authors that brought this to us, but it's different from these other books that are claimed to be revelations because they tell you it's co-creative. In other words, they interacted with these humans, over 18 years, and let the humans shape it by their questions. So it's interactive. But in addition, they state that the celestial, the angelic authors, they said, we went about reading everything you humans had written in the field of spirituality, in the field of history, theology. We read all your stuff. We read it, and then we embedded human ideas into this book because we wanted to give sort of due respect to human thought, the best of human thought, and because we're not permitted to just drop this thing out of heaven without reference to what you've done, because we want to recognize you. We don't want to overwhelm you with something that's so far out of your realm. So they sandwich in there. They state 2,000 ideas of human origin, and you can almost see them. You can almost recognize, oh, that's quoted from Aristotle. Oh, look, that's like from Plato. Or look, that's from the poet John Keats. I recently found something, but they don't footnote it, but they borrow it and then they enhance it. They actually enhance it, and it was actually John Keats, the 19th century poet, romantic poet, who wrote a piece about the soul. And he called it soul making. We're engaged in soul making, and they actually wrap this idea of soul growth around his idea of the soul, but then they enhance it like 100 times more information. And so he's known as what they call a human source of the Urantia Revelation. So the text is revelatory, but it's a marriage of human thought and angelic thought.
Oh, that's a great way to explain it. Thank you. And you were talking about we're creating souls. What does the Urantia book say about the human soul?
Bernard, what it says is, the subject of my book. It's like an architecture of the self. So think of the self as we know it today. The higher self, and the ego and sort of the human mind and emotion, and these parts of the self.
Hmm.
And the Urantia book helps you kind of gives you a reorganized view of the self and states that yes, there's a higher self, but the higher self is not the soul,
Right.
because we tend to, particularly Christians, they tend to speak interchangeably the soul, the self, the spirit. They don't have a clear distinction, and it's unfortunate because the Urantia book and other esoteric sources tell you that the spirit part of the self, the higher self, is non-evolving. It's like God's gift to you, the spark of God within you.
Right.
That's deity, so that doesn't evolve by definition. But the part of you that evolves is the part of you that's in relationship to deity, to divinity within you. So the divinity within you, which the Urantia book has this odd phrase, they call it the thought adjuster. They also call it the dwelling spirit. They say the dwelling spirit is guiding you. It's an internal guide, but it's more than that, because it's also monitoring your experience, and when it sees an experience that's worth saving into your soul, like hitting the save button, it saves the experience energetically. It puts a deposit into your soul.
Like assimilation.
It's an assimilation of the actual outer
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
but it's an inner and outer experience. It sort of envelops that and then drops it into you as your soul memory, which is different from your brain memories, right?
Yeah.
So when you die, the brain memories die, but something has to live. That once you drop the body. So there's the soul memories that are in like what you might call the soul brain, and that survives, for the next incarnation. So something has to be the mechanism, not the mechanism, but the function that creates that. And we think of it as karma, right? That there's a karmic imprint of your experiences, and so think of it that way. And so everything, good, bad, or ugly, that is you, that's truly essentially you, is there, and that becomes your character, your virtues. And so, but the essential point is that the soul is evolving, but the spirit part of yourself is co-creating it, and it's really like, it's sort of like a parent looking at you and saying, "Oh, well, that's really good. We're going to put that into a photo album of your life, to be retrievable energetically, eternally." So your soul's immortal. So it's like this immortal photo album.
It's almost as if, to me, and you let me know if this makes any sense, it's almost as if I could layer my concept, my alchemical pattern or ideas of the higher self, the Akashic record, and our source consciousness right on top of what exactly you're saying. It's almost like the same thing but with a different language, if that makes sense. Hold that thought, though, Byron. We are up on a break here, and we'll be right back, and we're going to continue our discussion with Byron. We'll be right back.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We are the #1 listener-supported radio station in the world, with two stations, or two studios, Studio A and Studio B, with, I think we got 40 something radio shows playing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you are at freedomslips.com, please do make a contribution to support the radio station as well. Please consider becoming a patron of this show by joining my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Bernard Alvarez. Not only do you get all the archives, but you also get classes, videos, and other consciousness work that I offer on that particular page to my patrons. Anyway, thank you, and let me welcome Byron back to the show. Hello, Byron. Welcome back.
Good to be back. And just, Bernard, let me just say how much I appreciate you and your work and what you're doing here on the radio and all the rest that you do. Thank God for it.
Oh, I thank you so much for that, and same to you, Byron. By all means, same to you. With that being said, before the break, I was kind of, I guess, simplifying what we were talking about when it came to the higher self, the soul, and the oversoul, and I kind of maybe need to simplify what I was trying to say. Uh, it's almost as if the way I kind of see it is almost as if we have our higher self, which is kind of what you were saying, like the parent looking over the body and or the mind, and it's through the higher self that we can communicate with what I call source consciousness, and perhaps maybe that's what you're referring to when you say the soul, and that part is the divine part of us that's connected to divinity, God, or source. Is that kind of a decent parallel that I made there?
Yeah, it's decent, and just a little bit of enhancements. The Urantia Book view is that the higher self is deity, but they call it a God fragment. It's like a fragment
Yes.
of a pure deity, and this is a rough one for a lot of people to imagine that God loves them enough to give a part of God into them.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, do I have the self-esteem to accept that to be the case?
Yes.
That I'm walking around carrying a pure spark of deity in me that is not, so you're not, it's source is in you.
Yes,
and
yes.
that's why you're a creative source. And that's a pretty different thing than your soul. That the soul is, and so much of my book is why we need to distinguish the soul from the spirit self.
I see.
The soul is not anything energetically. The soul is not at that vibrational level, which is infinite. It's the highest level of that you have that exists in the universe is in you, and so you reach up to that in your decisions every day. If you're particularly if you're an idealistic person, you're a tree, but you're not fusing with that until at the very end of the path. And so the Urantia Book says we have this God fusion that we have where we totally identify with the spirit self. But until between now and then, we're identified either with our body, our ego, or if we're growing, we identify with our soul. And the soul is a alchemical mix of the human and the divine.
Yeah.
So really pretty different than the spirit self.
Yeah. Yes, and I can agree with all of that wholeheartedly. Thank you. Now let me ask you about your book. What drew you or inspired you to want to write a book about the evolving soul and how it relates to the Urantia Revelation? What is the gist of your message you're trying to bring forth in it?
Thank you for that question. I've been involved with the Urantia movement for 40 years, and my view, Bernard, and I can say on your show, is that the Urantia Revelation has been actively suppressed and by dark forces.
Yes.
And because it is in part a revelation of who they are. The original history of how the cabal, if you will,
Yes.
Came into being in prehistoric times, and it's a very different story than the Anunnaki story. So the Urantia Book has an alternative. But anyway, so this cabal, continued to reign on Earth, right on down to the reception of New Age information, like the Urantia Book, and in some sense they fostered the New Age, but in another sense they suppressed the really revolutionary information. And to me, the Urantia Book is revolutionary, and that's why most of our friends and colleagues don't know anything about it, because it didn't get disseminated.
I see.
Very, very well. It was in bookstores, but there was never a review. There was never any coverage, even in the alternative media and New Age sort of media, until pretty recently, and only because of a few people like myself that got, because I'm in the media business, so I recognize, hey, somebody needs to cover this.
Yeah.
So I decided to do a book that was introductory, that to give an introduction to this thing, that for folks like us. So coming from our culture, our whatever you want to call it, cultural and creative culture,
right?
So that would relate to what we now know about meditation, what we know about consciousness studies, what we, I have a lot on Ken Wilber, for example, in relation to this, and Buddhism in relation. So I'm trying to build bridges that were not built in the previously, because the Urantia movement became inward looking because they were suppressed,
Yeah.
and so they go to their meetings, and there's not an interface to the outside world. So I felt that was sort of my job to do that. Now that I'm, in my mid-60s, so what do we got to lose,
right.
So
I can relate to what you're saying, actually. And it's very interesting, and I'm glad you brought up the suppression of information. I personally feel, and it is my observation and my intuition, as well as my intellect of doing, studying these types of work, the mystical, the esoteric, and human enlightenment and consciousness, that, the greatest conspiracy that is out there is the suppression of human consciousness. And it seems that everywhere we look, we are constantly being bombarded to be distracted from the growth of our consciousness, and to be able to tap in to those higher realms that you speak of. So I firmly and wholeheartedly support exactly what you mean by that. It's astounding when you start realizing and seeing how much we have been suppressed, consciously speaking.
We have been suppressed in every domain, economic, political, but also cultural and spiritual. And it's the tragedy with the Urantia Revelation, if you will, is that it's a big book. It's 2,000 pages, and when it came through and was published in the 50s, people were reading books. They had the span of attention to read.
Yeah.
Now we've been dumbed down, and we've been kind of under attack. And people don't have the span of attention, to read something like this. And I find that all the time. I have a lot of friends and colleagues that want to read this thing, but they say, I'm running, to my second job, and I don't have any energy to do this, but I want to do it. So it's another reason I did a book that summarizes it for folks like that.
Oh, good.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
really important. That's really important. I imagine, and I always kid around about my work, that I'm with a network called Full Screen. It's a YouTube network, and my quote unquote YouTube manager is always getting on me about breaking things down into 5-minute blurbs, that my shows are too long or my videos are too long. You want to get their attention and hold it. I'm like, I can't get the point across in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I try to break it down in 5 minutes and maybe link them to the full message, but I can't imagine trying to break down the Urantia book into a million 5-minute, talking points,
So there are people that are now doing that on YouTube. They have little short things, 5-10 minutes, but it defeats the purpose a little bit. But it's better than nothing.
Yes, absolutely.
But we're revolutionaries, and we're encouraging people to expand their consciousness, which means expanding your span of attention.
Yeah. And it's an effort. It takes an effort.
You have to meditate. You have to have your awareness has to be strengthened through meditation and prayer and communion and worship, so that you can take it in what's happening in this big universe with and that frees you from the clutches of this culture, which is destroying. They're doing mind control on us.
Yes, absolutely. And with that being said, so many people argue that it's useless to try to evolve. It's we're not going to win. That this timeline is doomed, and I personally don't believe that. I do believe this is all a part of the process. All the ugliness that we're seeing come forth in today's world, for me, it acts like a rebound to make me want to go the opposite direction. At least my soul is very rebellious that way. But so what would you tell somebody? What is the purpose of evolving our soul and doing this work as you relate it to in your book?
Another great question. The soul evolves unconsciously, so you don't have to consciously, intentionally evolve your soul, because the loving Father, Mother, God cares about your life, and so the divine is already evolving your soul because the divine wants to have the memory of your life present to the divine, because it actually grows God's presence in the universe. So it's happening behind the scenes anyway. So the idea of my book is that's already happening, but you can do it. Obviously, you can do it more consciously by making better decisions and by improving the quality of your consciousness. That improves the quality of your soul, so that your growth is more robust, and so you have more joy and happiness too. On top of that, but as you grow in these more conscious ways, it benefits everything and everybody, including it benefits God, because there's a part of deity in the Urantia Revelation that's very important for folks who think about God and theology, to realize that deity also evolves, and that God is infinite, perfect, omnipresent, omnipotent in one aspect, the primary aspect. But there's a secondary aspect of deity that some of the Christian theologians now talk about, which is obviously there's this oversoul that is evolving, which is the collective. It's the Jungian collective that is evolving, and it's a whole category of theology called process theology, evolutionary theology. But you don't have to cancel out that God is also what they call existential. It's existing, self-existing from eternity. But God came out into space and time for a reason, which is to evolve us with us, co-creatively evolving with us, and fulfilling that part of deity which needs and wants to have the human point of view represented cosmically. And that's really the purpose of creating beings that have souls.
That's very interesting, and I'm my jaw is dropping, even though you can't see it the way we're talking right now, because of the fact that I've been asked to be in a film about channelers, and the question or the focus of the film is, okay, so we evolve to alignment with source. We evolve to perfect enlightenment and soul enlightenment. But what's beyond that? And there's something more beyond that. And to me, that's what I'm hearing you describe, that even the perfection of God and divinity is also beyond the scope or the boundaries of what we conceive it to be, or even experience it in an ecstatic state, perhaps.
Yeah, it's always utterly beyond what we can know and what we can perceive. So it's even if you have what they call God fusion in the Urantia Book, which is enlightenment, but it's post enlightenment. You can be enlightened like Buddha, but you still haven't fused with the divine self. And once you fuse with it, you cannot be in a body. So it's like the rainbow body phenomenon in Tibetan Buddhism, where these monks, their bodies disappear,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And in their meditation. So when that happens, that is, you have fused with the divine self. But even beyond that, there are many. So the Urantia book is so mind-boggling, because even in the afterlife, when this happens, this fusion does happen to all of us. We identify fully with spirit. Then we have an eternal life in front of us, where there's more ascension. You're actually ascending beyond that level. And the Urantia book is, without a doubt, the world's most advanced revelation about the afterlife. There's nothing close to its discussion of these higher levels of ascension, which take us all the way to what they call the central universe, the source universe. Then I should add, I don't know if we have a lot of time for all this, but that the Urantia book states that most of the galaxies in the universe are uninhabited, but there are certain galaxies that are inhabited by humanoid beings, and those are in kind of the inner band of the universe. But when we perfect ourselves in the distant future, we are sent out to the distant galaxies as perfected humans. We're like now deities, and we will be like administrators and teachers in those distant galaxies. So there's a lot beyond what we're told.
And the gist of what you're saying, I can resonate with, because I myself have felt and experienced that in my own out of body experiences, for lack of a better term. And I love the fact that it is somewhere written down that people can relate to, or at least be able to read into that. And it's very funny. My next question to you was, does the Revelation talk about life beyond planet Earth? So I appreciate that. Perfect timing. And okay, well, actually, I do have a question in relation to that. Does it talk about extraterrestrial or, well, maybe I guess you kind of already answered that, the transdimensional evolved beings of light, for lack of a better term? Is there any reference to that in the Revelation, or within your book, for that matter?
Yeah, my book summarizes that, and you have to, because that's part of the soul evolution, is to become aware of extraterrestrial beings and interdimensional, angelic
Yes.
beings,
Yeah.
and that they are helping us ascend and grow the soul, and so one has to be aware of them. But I have another book which I'm doing, which is more about that, the cosmology of the Urantia book.
Oh,
Oh yeah, that'll
that
be a
sounds
fun.
very interesting.
It'll be really a lot of fun. It'll take you a
That's
little.
not out yet?
No, it doesn't. Yeah,
We're definitely
well,
going to have to come back and talk about
yeah, we'll
that.
have to get into that, now or later, because I talk about it all the time when I give talks. But that the extraterrestrial aspect of the Urantia book is extensive, because you remember that they were talking to us in the 1930s and 40s,
Yeah.
when it wasn't even known that there was anything beyond the Milky Way.
Yeah,
And they
absolutely.
weren't even sure there was a Milky Way in the 20s, 30s, and so here they're saying there are billions, millions of galaxies, and a certain subset of them are inhabited, and they are planets, and these planets with humans are of certain types, depending on the atmosphere, the gravity, the minerals on, so they're different types of humans, but all of them have souls.
Ah, I love it. Well, Byron, I hate to say we are almost out of time, and I'm really enjoying this talk with you today. But before we go, why don't you remind everybody where they can find out more information about your work? Where can they find the book, the new book?
Yeah, the book, Your Evolving Soul, is available anywhere you buy books. And my site is souls, evolving-souls.org. And you'll see information about my work, and all, I do podcasts as well, and all that sort of thing. And sign up, because I have a lot of new updates coming, because we have new celestial information since the Urantia book.
Oh, wonderful.
they're channeling, and this should be in that channeling field because there's a huge new channeling phenomenon of the authors of the Urantia book returning to add new information,
Oh,
and
that's great.
certainly so that's a whole other subject. But so anyway, hope folks sign up there to hear more about it. And but everybody keep coming back to Bernard's show too. It's a great show.
Speak with you today. Speaking of the show and speaking of aliens, next week from Ancient Aliens and beyond, and all the work that he's done in Peru with the elongated skulls, Brian Forster is going to be joining me live. I believe he's in Peru right now, so he might be. The broadband might not be so great, guys, so be prepared. But Brian Forrester will be joining me next week, talking about more discoveries he's had with these elongated skull beings. Some of them are not showing humanoid DNA, so this is going to be very interesting as we look at the architecture and I mean just the tools that were used by the ancients in that area. There's just no way that it could have been what we call how do we say primitive tools. I mean, it looks like lasers and stuff were used, but it should be a very interesting discussion. And of course, speaking of connecting with your divine self, your higher self, and your spirit guides, remember that this Saturday on 11/11, I will be doing that course, 3-hour course live with you on Meet Your Spirit Guide. So you can go to bernardalvarez.com to register for that. And I'm wondering, I guess it looks like we might have another minute or two. And with that minute or two, Byron, I'd like to ask this. I might have even asked this of you before. If you could sum up, if you knew that the entire world was listening to you right now, what would be the one thing you would want to say to the entire planet, the entire human race?
Oh,
That's a
that we
tough
should.
one.
That's a big one. That we should know how much we are loved, and that when you enter into this realm of love, that is the divine's own showering of light and love on you, it's absolutely life transforming. And through meditation, prayer, and worship, we can feel that love, which is really within us and outside of us. It's both. We're surrounded by the love and the light, and just surrender to it and be grateful.
Absolutely. And I think we have to choose to be grateful sometimes, unfortunately. A lot of times we forget how wonderful life can be when we're bombarded with all this mess around us. But once again, thank you very much, Byron, and I look forward to hearing more about your new book. So please get in contact with us. Let us know
Okay, sure will, Bernard.
when
What a
you're
pleasure to be on the show with you.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. And everybody, that's it for today, and that's it for this week. I love you. We'll see you next week here on Revolution Radio on the Just Bernard Show with Brian Forrester. Bye bye now.